the vast majority of Christians today are celebrating that Christ is risen. There's one or two groups in the Orthodox tradition who celebrate at a different time, but by and large, this is the particular time that we're celebrating. So here's what I want to talk about. I have a couple of notes, and then once I get through my notes, we'll get into other things. If this event that we call the resurrection of Jesus Christ is actually true, if it's true, if we can actually spend time examining some of the evidence, and if we can reach some of the various conclusions through methods that have been used in investigating real crimes, and I'm talking about the techniques that were used by a man who became really, for skeptics, probably the most important read that this individual did for Christians, Dr. Simon Greenleaf, who was the Royal Professor of Law at Harvard. And before this book that I'm referencing, he actually wrote a treatise, which I'll read you, I'll quote the exact title so that no one comes to say, oh, you didn't say that right. But a treatise on the law of evidence, which is still understood today as the greatest single authority on this subject of the law of evidence. In fact, his work has been used as the template and is still used today. That particular work is still used today for people who are learning how to, and eventually if their choice is to engage in maybe as a career, a lawyer or something, you would be studying his works, which are still highly regarded today. But in his book, that is really pertaining to the resurrection, he took the exact same principles that are in his book on the law of evidences that he himself used for application to real crimes and real trials, and brought it into the realm of investigating the resurrection. And I like the fact that this is a person who not only was of high standing within the academic realm, but also we're talking about someone who's highly respected within that particular community and basically still is today by that work. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is there are so many people within Christendom, unfortunately, who are misled. They believe that there is no evidence, that all this is circumstantial, that there's no way to prove. And it is people like Dr. Simon Greenleaf, with his technique and, as I said, his expertise in the law of evidence in the secular realm and importing it to investigate the resurrection, that I've said many times, I really recommend that people treat the resurrection just like that instead of carrying around ideas. And most of them, if you start talking to people, you realize there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of fictitious beliefs out there that are not rooted in fact. So I like Dr. Greenleaf for that. As I said, a lawyer with a brilliant mind. The other one that comes to mind, and I'm referencing these people for another reason. Many people who approach the resurrection or Christianity tend to do this, which I find quite annoying. The idea, I guess, is that if you study the Bible, or if you believe in a God, if you believe in the God of the Bible, that makes you a person who basically must be weak in spirit, someone who is maybe of a low moral or a low social standing, because only people who are deprived of information could actually cling to this type of information and call it true, real, and authentic. So I'm taking you through some of the names that many people who've been here for years have heard me reference. Dr. Simon Greenleaf, as I said, well established. In fact, he played a vital part in establishing the Harvard Law School as it is today, as we know it today. The second one is Dr. Frank Morrison, who, again, another attorney who actually set out in his work to disprove. Basically, his mission was, I'm going to show these Christians that they are so misguided. And what happened is, he, in his book, Who Moved the Stone, he basically tells, at least some of those versions, some of those earlier publications of that book, tell you the title of the book that he was going to write, which was to disprove Christianity. And he ended up in examining the evidence, not fact, not mythological, not mom and pop passing it down to you, but he examined the evidence as an attorney and walked away and said, there is no doubt this happened, and titled the book, Who Moved the Stone, which has become a staple for people who want to glean better insight into approaching this subject in a very analytical way, because I personally spent a journey like that. As I've shared with you, came into the church with certain ideas that were put into my brain from a faith that left me quite empty. And it was when I started searching out and finding that many of the things that I held as basic tenets of my faith were not rooted in the Bible. They were rooted in things that people had propagated through the centuries that just becomes a held belief passed down from generation to generation. And that, my friends, is not the Word of God. So going back to this, I have a list here of a few people that are thinking people. They are accomplished scholars. They are people who, if we analyze their work, you have to walk away saying that these are not people who were weak in their mindset. As I said, they set out to disprove that the resurrection ever occurred. There is another person here that I'd like to mention who I've not mentioned before, who is Thomas Arnold, who authored the 3-volume series on the history of Rome, but he was the holder of the chair of modern history at Oxford. And I'm going to read his quote, "I have been used for many years to study the histories of other times and to examine and weigh the evidence of those who have written about them. And I know of no one fact in the history of humankind which is proved better and by fuller evidence of every sort than the understanding of a fair inquirer," he says, "than the sign that God hath given us that Christ died and rose again from the dead." These are people in high ranking. John Singleton, who is known as Lord Lyndhurst, remembered as one of the greatest legal thinkers in British history. And I could go on, but all of these came to some certain conclusion, and most of these started off as disbelievers, atheists, rejectors of the faith. And the greatest one of all, for we who want to learn more and understand more, the greatest, I think, intellectual mind of our modern times is C.S. Lewis, who, when he started his journey, a lot of people do not know that his academic accomplishments, he was professor of medieval history and other histories at Magdalen College, and well-respected, and a well-respected atheist. In fact, many of the surrounding people that he considered his friends kind of followed in the same path, that when he actually did get converted and came to the faith, and by the way, it wasn't under the influence of a preacher yelling from the pulpit saying, "You must believe." All of these came to this conclusion by studying, by looking, by examining. But especially for this hard-headed intellectual thinker, and if you read his writings, he's not a fluff puff writer. Deep thought put into simple prose for people to read, came to the faith, and that was the last thing that he set out to do, was to herald the faith. He set out again, once more, to disprove it. So what do these men, and I could take men and women from every generation, some people think that there's not a great catalog of these individuals. Some people will say, well, you have nothing to go on. You just have to have faith. Well, this is where my expertise of 15 years of ministry here, and when I say thousands of hours spent with my nose in a book, connecting dots, trying to present information, while people who may not have the years of study will say there is no proof and there's nothing that you can tell me. But when I start pointing to things like archaeology, with archaeologists such as the famed Ramsay, the archaeologist Ramsay, and again, once more, if you look at these people's lives, their whole careers would be ruined in many ways. If you want to be taken seriously, you wouldn't talk about a risen Christ or risen Savior. You'd be talking about things that people can actually wrap their mind around. But another one of these, who was a famed archaeologist, same pattern. We can look at these people within archaeology. We can look at these people within, and I could go through expertise by expertise when we talk about the most extant manuscripts and fragments that can be absolutely dated both by the style of their writing, whether they be in uncial, those large block letters of Greek, or the minuscule writing, or whether we're looking at different linguistic approaches, the ink, the papyri, the parchment. And I've mentioned many times that there is so much evidence that if people will actually take the time, which can't happen in an hour, probably can't happen in 5 or 10 hours. It's collective information. It's not like you're going to hear me in 1 hour and say, that's it, you've sold me. That's not what I'm trying to do either. Mine is to present enough information to get some people to start thinking outside of the box, to start thinking outside of their traditions, and most importantly, to ask some questions. God will not fall off his throne if you ask a question. And quite frankly, I've had some pretty good zingers tossed at me. I have no problem defending my faith. My faith is not rooted in, I feel that Jesus lives, and I'm going to tell you that I know it in my heart. That's wonderful for me, but it does nothing to explain the factual basis of the resurrection. Now, there'll be people who will say, well, what facts do you have? Because everything is, it's in the Bible, and we don't even know the veracity of the writings. I'm not going to engage in this today, but I'm going to present this in a way with enough information that hopefully you come back next week, because I am still in a series, believe it or not, even today, on heaven and hell. I know, I'm a one-track mind person, so, kill me for that. But the thing that I want to really touch on is that if one is willing to use the discipline, not to take me at my word, not to be persuaded by emotive ideology, but to actually look at the hundreds of years that we have of people who have spent their life investigating and have come up conclusively with information. Now, granted, there'll be people, a la David Hume. David Hume's contribution to society and philosophy is that a miracle can occur, and did everything in his power, in his presentation, to show that a miracle is contrary to nature, and therefore it cannot happen. And he goes through very interesting arguments, but the problem is that we're dealing with the things of God, and when we say a statement like, God can bend the rules of nature, God can bend the laws of nature, and we know that he did. For God to be God, he has all power. Well, people say, well, how can that be? Well, I'm telling you that, again, you have to explain certain things, justify them, or come back to a set frame of reference that you're going to look at this in a more factual way. And the analysis doesn't erode what will come afterwards, which is feelings, emotive feelings that say, after having examined the evidence, I can say, he lives, he is risen. Now, there is one irrefutable proof that when people say, well, what historical irrefutable proof can you say? Well, the one at the top of the list is, and if you're willing to spend the time to examine why there are two tombs and how these two tombs came about, but whether you pick one tomb or the other, they're both empty. That's a fact. Now, there'll be people who will argue that there was never a body in the tomb, that because there are two tombs that we can't really believe which one is which. There's a lot of ideas that float around in terms to rebut that one fact, but the fact is that if you go to the tomb today, if you look at the tomb for as long as it's been chronicled after its discoveries, you will realize that the same fact has been staring people in the face for this amount of time. There is actually two empty tombs, depending on which tomb you're going to look at, but they're both empty. No one's going to argue that, well, except for the people who've placed a bunch of candles and relics in one or the other. But having said that, I think that it is important to approach this subject the way I'm doing. Now, there'll be people who will say that everything is hinged on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But I want to talk about something which will show you the difference in the way we might say something and how people might understand it. For example, let's just talk about an individual. I'm talking about someone you may know, a friend of yours, who dies. They're dead. You went to their funeral. They're dead. And then they come back to life. Of course, you say, well, that's really out there. I'm making this up as a hypothetical to make my point. But you would have to conclude that this individual is either a spirit ghost or an apparition of some kind, maybe a spirit, not a ghost-like spirit, but a spirit, or that this individual actually came back from the dead. Those are your options. Well, you can maybe, I don't know, come up with something else, but those are the three I could think of. Now, just because somebody comes back from the dead does not make them a Messiah. And why do I say that? Because if you go through the Bible, and if you read the Bible, there are many people who came back from the dead. Just take a look at the people who came back from the dead in absolute body form, as in Elisha's raising of the widow's son, Elijah's raising of the widow's son. These are two different events. We could talk about the man who came in contact with the bones of the prophet, who then it was a funeral procession. His bones came in contact and he was risen from the dead. We could talk about the widow Nain in the New Testament, the raising of Jairus' daughter, the raising of Lazarus, of Dorcas, of Eutychus. These all came back from the dead. They were brought back up from the dead. Or we could talk about the conjuring up of Samuel's spirit by a spirit medium, by King Saul. Were all of these apparitions, or putting aside Samuel, were all of the rest of these apparitions, or were these people brought back to life? Some of these stories, especially concerning Elijah and Elisha, go into great detail about what they did to revive those children that were brought back to life. They were dead and they were brought back to life. But coming back to life from the dead, biblically speaking, is not a sign of messiahship. And as I've just said, with all these people being raised from the dead, there's something else we have to look at from the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which separates his coming back from the dead as radically different than all those that were raised up from the dead. Now, before I go into that, I'm going to mix history and other faiths. I'm going to mix all kinds of stuff so you can see it takes a lot of information just to prove one point. A lot of people within the Christian faith, I read a poll from one of the Pew polls about asking people whether or not they actually believe that Jesus physically resurrected from the dead. And the numbers are very disappointing. And that comes back to not the people, but the preachers, not providing hardcore information that is not only thought-provoking, but challenges the believer, the reader, the person who's striving to learn, to analyze certain things in a more critical and analytical way to come to conclusive points about certain things versus let's talk about social issues, let's talk about everything else but the gospel message, so that you have no solid foundation at the core of what you call your faith. Do you understand what I'm saying? Kind of? Okay. So, before I tackle what I'm going to say, let me just say this. Many people don't know Christianity is not the only religion in terms of the panoply or the pantheon, if you will, of the world's religions that talks about resurrection of the dead. So don't think that Christianity has a unique market on this particular subject, because it doesn't. In fact, you'd be pleasantly surprised if you read in Islam, for example, and the Sunni and the Shia, which are two different sects within Islam that are and have been always at war, deciding who is the rightful successor of Muhammad, and that's what basically that's all about, more or less. Sorry to simplify it for you who know the history, but I don't want to bore those who don't. But within their sects of Islam, that is the Sunni and the Shiite, they actually believe in the Sunni sect. Their belief is that you are essentially judged whether you did righteous or wickedly upon the earth. And after your judgment, you will either be essentially, you are resurrected. The resurrection of all souls upon who lived on the earth will happen, and then it will be judged who goes to everlasting paradise versus who goes to an everlasting place of torment. But they believe in a resurrection. And if you go to the Shiites, they believe with the 12th pillar of Islam that the last imam, and it says clearly in their writings that the last imam, after the resurrection of all the souls upon the earth, the last imam will return with Jesus Christ to the earth. So don't think we have a unique reference to resurrection, nor, by the way, if you're into comparative religions, which I am, I like to study and understand the world's beliefs and how they came to these conclusions. If you examine the various, and I'm going to call them this way, sects within Judaism. Now, Judaism is not one group of people, if you will, just like within Christianity, we have groups that are broken up to specific beliefs, like the Baptists who believe one way, or the Methodists who believe another way. Within Judaism, you've got Jews that are Orthodox, you've got practicing, you've got Reform. There's a breakdown of probably anywhere, I believe it's minimally 7 that are recognized within Judaism, and they do not all hold the same belief for the afterlife. So within some frames of Judaism, there are some Jews that actually believe in a resurrection from the dead at the end of time. And if you're looking, you'll find that resurrection appears even within Zoroastrianism. They've got a very unique take on resurrection. That is, when the soul dies, it is essentially the soul is brought to this, what's called the Chinvat Bridge. And at that bridge, the soul comes to the center of the bridge and is confronted with a sword. If the person has had a righteous soul, the sword turns and lets them pass into the 4 levels of heaven. And if they've been a wicked soul, the sword turns and basically slashes them, and they fall off the bridge into the 4 layers of hell. But they too believe in a resurrection at the end of time. So it cannot be, we talk about Christians who believe in the resurrection, and we believe in the resurrected Christ. And somehow we appear to many non-believers as wacky and crazy. But if you're looking at the world's religions, you have to see that there is, just like in the creation accounts of all the world's religions, there will be some common threads which ultimately would lead any person to conclude that within antiquity, there was a stream that flowed from one source, and that source began to be corrupted, perverted, changed as people migrated, as people strayed away from oral traditions or teachings or caricatures or perversions or deities, pagans, whatever you want to call. But there had to have been a common stream, even if you study Buddhism. And Buddhism and Hinduism believe in reincarnation. But there is a desire, especially within Buddhism, to be purged of the cares or the concerns, to be essentially set free in nirvana by following the Eightfold Path. That essentially is supposed to set you free, but if one does not obtain nirvana, then one keeps coming back. Could be in the form of a human, an animal, but there too, even though that is called reincarnation, the concept of life not ending is still there. And you could say, well, you're reaching for that, but I'm trying to make a point. We could look at the Hindus, we could look at the Jains, the Shintos, and compare some common threads, which when you step back, you say, well, maybe there's something we have to look at about the uniqueness of Christ's resurrection. Why? Because all of these other individuals risen in the Bible, they eventually died. Their time to be permanently resurrected has not yet come. Just as ours, when our time will come to pass from this world, will not be until the appointed time. And the Bible spells that out too. So when I talk about these things, I'm really addressing a much broader audience in discussing the resurrection. Now, if we talk about the uniqueness of Christ's resurrection, and as I said, I may not even finish what I have to say, but that'll be a dangler and you'll have to come back. That's what I love doing, is frustrating people. But if you begin to examine the death and more specifically the resurrection of Christ, you come up with some very interesting thoughts. And I'm going to share them with you, and then we'll see where this can lead us. First of all, there are people who would take this Bible, it's 66 books, and say, well, it's all dubious, it's not reliable, and you can't go on anything. Let me just digress to one thought I said about some of these great scholars who set out as atheists and then in turn came back as hardcore believers of the faith. Many of them have common denominator expressions in their thought process once they reach a conclusion, which is there is an enormous amount of evidence to examine if one will take the blinders off and recognize, this is from a history professor, a law professor. I mean, these are high academic minds who usually would fall into there's not enough proof and I can't stake my career or my life on that, to those who have said, if you're willing to look at the evidence and the proof, there is more abundant evidence and proof factually than almost for any other historical event. Now, the world looks at, and the church at large looks at what I just said and flips it and says, no, we can prove secular history far better than we can for the evidence of this act, this one act. But that's quite problematic, because even outside of our own writings, there have been chronicles, and I've quoted this many times, of secular historians, secular writers very close to the time of Christ and within possibly a 50-year period or less, discussing these events, but not so much for Christians to be sparked with hope of the resurrection, but to discuss the impossibility and how we can approach this and recognize there is a great difference between the resurrection of Jesus Christ and everything else that exists. For one, nowhere in comparative religion and nowhere on the pages of history did anyone ever make the claims that Jesus made. He said that there was something wrong with the world that only his death and his resurrection could fix, making claims about himself. Even his followers made claims about him. And I've said over and over again that if we look at the claims Jesus made, they're pretty staggering. If you read what the Bible says that Jesus said, before Abraham was, I was, or I am, which touches on something that John understood, the pre-existence of Christ before he came in the flesh. In other words, Christ wasn't born of a virgin and just came into being. We know at the beginning of creation there was the three, what we call the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And in Genesis, right there at the beginning of the book, if you're reading the Hebrew, we read about the Elohim, that is that majestic plural in the Hebrew, that is not a singular, it is not used for anything else but to describe the plurality of God. So we're not talking about many gods, we're talking about one. This is the mystery of explaining the Trinity, which I'm not going to attempt to do, but one in three in one, however that works. So the point about Jesus' resurrection that is so radical is not only was it prophesied for hundreds of years before it happened in diverse places from diverse people in diverse writings through the Old Testament, but when you begin to examine the correlation between texts, for example, when they came and they asked Jesus, what sign can you give us? We want a sign. And he said, there'll be no sign except the sign of Jonah, that Jonah was in the great, it wasn't a whale, he was in the great fish's belly for 3 days and 3 nights. And he clearly says, regarding this, the narrative after that is that he said this speaking about his death and resurrection. Now, there'll be people, again, who study the Bible or who have read Jonah. And by the way, if you remember, I picked apart Jonah pretty much almost word for word. I had you in, that's a 4-chapter book, correct? I think we had many, many messages. So if anybody's picked something apart and eaten all the meat off the bone, it's yours truly. And I can tell you that, you know, you can talk about Jonah and say, well, that's a fictitious story and it's mythological in its essence. But now, a man who walks the earth several hundred years later, being, of course, familiar with the writings of old, because he was the inspiration for the writings of old, says that there'll be no sign except this sign, for which the Jews in that day would have understood 3 days and 3 nights. He said the same thing about the temple, when he said, essentially, tear this temple down and I'll raise it up again. And they said, it took hundreds of years to build this temple. These are the religious people around him. This guy's out of his mind. They didn't understand. He was talking about the temple of his body. And very plainly, over and over again, if we're willing to look. And that brings me back to the question of the authenticity and the veracity of the writings, because that's where people like to go first, and they say, well, how can we believe this? And I can't, as I said, I can't prove all this in 1 hour. There's just so much information. But I will say this. Unlike Islam, who has preserved their writings with a single language, unlike Islam, the oddity of the message, the good news is not a whole bunch of writing and caricatured stories, and the good news is Jesus is risen. And because he is risen, we too shall rise. That's his promise to us. With that being said, you begin to analyze unlike, for example, as I said, Islam, which kept a single language for its transmission, if you begin to follow the explosive journey of the gospel as it is spread after the death of Christ, I urge you to consider a couple of things. They're questions to ask that are quite important, because the initial and first transmission of the gospel message is given by what we call the Great Commission, the end of Matthew, specifically Matthew 28, where Jesus says, "Go ye into all the nations, make disciples," which simply means learners, teaching them everything that is relevant to our faith. And that was the last part, was in my words. And we know that after his death and resurrection, eventually, after the day of Pentecost, they went out and they began to preach and proclaim the message, the good news, the gospel. He is risen. He is risen from the dead. But if you analyze in the realm of that spreading forth, there are a couple of important questions and considerations. One of them is, if Jesus didn't make those claims, or his disciples didn't hear the claims, or they chose to ignore them, they disbelieved them, or they didn't understand them, for certain, after he was dead, they knew that he had died on the cross. And when he was risen, we have various records of him appearing. But the interesting thing that people question is, why did he only appear to these people? And why didn't he appear to other people? And the doubters will come back and say, there's got to be something wrong with the record, the veracity. Are these documents reliable? And I digress again. I keep going back to this same thing. As these went out to tell about the good news, he is risen. We have Thomas, who goes to Malapur, India, who gets pierced by a Brahmin sword. There are people who are not going to hear, but somebody did, because they become the Thomas Christians of India, and still to this day, albeit a small band, the Thomas Christians still exist. We could talk about Peter. Whether or not it is true, whether or not he was crucified upside down, said, "I'm not worthy to be crucified like my Lord," but we have good reason and good record to believe that he was crucified upside down at Rome. And our understanding historically, before a large amount of man-made ideologies come wafting into the church under veneration of icons and relics, we have, prior to being named St. Peter's, we can ostensibly look at that and say, the claim is that Peter is buried there. But whatever the case may be, we know that there is a foundation there that dates from a very early date, archaeologically, historically speaking, which is not a shrine merely erected to some fictitious person. And if we keep looking at these disciples, we have Judas, not Judas Iscariot, but Judas Thaddeus, who was essentially martyred in Beirut, Lebanon. So we start to examine the spread of the gospel. And in fact, in the coming weeks, I am very determined, because I started working on it and compiling the information, to start asking the questions so that I can ultimately get it onto the internet, onto my website, so you can look at it at your own leisure. But to better understand, as the gospel was spreading out and began to be translated into different languages, we follow the translation and transmission of the Bible, and we recognize that there is a very rich history that is documented by how these things came about. The first one would be the Old Syriac. We're looking back at perhaps the second, possibly the very beginning of the 3rd century, that will take us all the way to the Peshitta, the Syriac version. And why do we start there? Because the Bible says they were first called Christians at Antioch, and it is essentially there, with Syrian eyes and ears, readers putting it into the tongue of the people. Even though Greek was circulating as the language of the day, people needed to read this in their own tongue. That eventually spreads out and is being carried, then gets translated into another language. And then languages are being developed expressly for the sake of translating the Bible. Take the Gothic language, which is it was created in the 4th century and extinct by sometime in the middle of the 6th to 7th century. Extinct. But it was created, although I shouldn't say it's extinct, because our roots actually, we can find our English roots in part in the Gothic Germanic structure. But if we look at that, it seems kind of crazy that they didn't have, these individuals, Eastern Germanic peoples, didn't have a gospel in their tongue until the 4th century. So the question is, should we go behind that and look at what they were using? That brings us back to follow the trail, and it's a paper trail that we follow. That leads us back to something as mind-blowing as the record of scribes who scribed. And you can't go that far back in certain cases, but we have good information. So when people just kind of glibly dismiss this as it's fantasy, it's mythological, it's a good story with a lot of embellishments, and you recognize, when I say the thousands of hours I have invested in investigating this subject through various different ways, not just strictly through the Bible, it really is imperative to spend, I think my late husband said for him it was 10 or 15 or 20 hours. I would say take my challenge and sit down, and please, for you folks who like to get your information off the internet, try and make it a reliable source. Don't go to Wikipedia. Don't use sources that are either modified, changed, or dubious. Look at information, whether it is a pro or con, to make the case, but find people who are real scholars. Anybody can post and say anything. That's what I love about this day and age, and people read it and they believe it and they become delusional. I'm asking you to take a hardcore look. For Catholic listeners out there, he was a really brilliant scholar, Fitzmyer. I think he actually was a Jesuit scholar. I may be mistaken. But if you're looking within your realm of what you have been brought up in, I highly suggest starting there with someone who has a background in understanding Catholicism, who actually pierced through this to pierce through a lot of the stuff. And that's what we're looking for. Hardcore information and facts, not fantasy. Now, when I come back to the Bible, again, the argument is, well, how can you rely on these? Well, I'm going to say, how can I not? As a person who loves history, I have to examine certain details included in here, which maybe people will say, well, it's easy to pepper in a few real things so that it becomes credible if it's a made-up or fictitious story. And I'll give you a perfect case in point of why I have intolerance to that type of mindset. And I'm very intolerant to that. Because that would have made real good sense until about 1960. Well, let me say this. It would have made sense until about the 50s. But in 1960, and until the year 1960, people said you cannot prove historically, you cannot find any historical evidence for Pontius Pilate outside of literature. But the fact of the matter is that in 1961, they excavated I think it's a 2x4 limestone inscription. It is dated authentically. They have dated the stone, the writing in Latin upon it. It is authentically placed to the time of Pilate. And when I say that, there's a sliding scale of probably within 2 or 3 years that they can pinpoint from whence this stone came from. Now, don't say there's no more evidence because it's all limited to literature and most of it's at best dubious, when you can actually go to archaeology, and I'm just naming one. And then, of course, if you're going to go back on the subject of Pontius Pilate, people say, well, and whatever happened to him? I find it interesting that people won't go and examine and turn over every stone, because the reality is Pontius Pilate was the one that essentially caved and gave way to the religious leaders of his day. And we might ask the question, is there any way to know or understand how this event would have changed Pontius Pilate or his beliefs or what happened to him? Now, there are many that say that he was ousted from his position and was either killed or committed suicide. But other records, believe it or not, trace Pontius Pilate to the south of France, where he fled for his life after the time that it was questioned about his commitment to Rome. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I can back up this, or that. There are things I can't back up, and I'll be free to tell you I can't back up any of that, but you can't discount archaeology. The same thing is true. I've told you about archaeological digs that have happened, we're in the year 2020, that have happened over the last 5 years, which have completely turned many of the historians and their we'll call it limited information on certain historical peoples and places within the Bible that they thought for years could not possibly exist. They're made up. That now they go to these places, they start digging, and they find, wow, a town was really here. There was a church here. There was a synagogue here. We find trace remnants of people's names in the inscription and catacombs. So when I keep going and you're really willing to look at the evidence, I'm asking you as a listener and as a learner, before you conclude that there are no facts and there's no hard evidence and the veracity of this writing and the transmission and somebody made glosses and made changes, and before you consider all that and draw a conclusion, I would say, just as somebody took the title of a book, The Evidence Demands a Verdict, the evidence does demand being examined properly, and then a verdict must come. And if you've spent the time examining the information and the evidence, and you come to a conclusion, Christ did not raise, this is all a bunch of skabala, it's not true, I'll respect you for having spent the time to examine it. Not take my word, examine it. But if you're not willing to spend the time to examine this in its entirety, what you're doing is you're making a judgment on something you have very little knowledge about, and this could affect your eternal destiny. So I would say, because most of us have a lot of time nowadays, it's probably a good challenge. Now, people will say, well, where do you look? Apart from the scriptures, where do you look? Well, I'm going to actually start with the scriptures, and I'll build from there. Let's talk about everything internally that Jesus said about himself, about the issues of the world, his claim about knowing things, for example, about heaven, that no earthly person could know because no one's been there. Some people have gotten glimpses into it. The Apostle Paul did. But when you start talking a certain way and you really listen to what Jesus said, some of it's downright nutty and needs to be flushed out as, is this guy a nut job, or what was he saying in actuality? My question is, how can you talk about heaven? In my Father's house are many mansions, and describing things about heaven that, whether they were revealed in their entirety, which they weren't to the disciples, but for certain they were revealed to John in the book of Revelation. He did get to see into the heavens. If you're going to take this posture, at least say that no one else in the history of humankind has made these type of claims and has backed them up. And the backup here is that he reappeared. Now, people will say, well, maybe it's a ghost, maybe it's an apparition. We've gone through all the theories. They hallucinated. They really wanted to believe. They made up the story. And we can go down the pathway that's been preached here for the better part of 50 years. But my intent is to say at some point you have to reduce it down to these people are reporting what they saw and what they're saying is true, or they're reporting a lie to protect their beloved leader, and the rest of it just falls flat on its face, as I told you when I approached my star witness, the Apostle Paul. And I found the right analogy finally to describe what type of reaction would the Apostle Paul have incurred for preaching Christ after this zealous Jew who was persecuting Christians gets converted. And I'll tell you what the example is, or the analogy is. It would be analogous to the Pope today, the head of the Catholic Church, announcing today, this Easter Sunday, that he is no longer a Catholic, but he has become a Protestant. Really, that's the best analogy I can think of, and the reason I'm saying that is because the Apostle Paul had high ranking and standing within the Sanhedrin. He was well respected within his community, within the religious community, within the social structures of his community. So to make this about face and tell it in such a preposterous way, there are times when that type of presentation you have to go, it's either completely nutty or it's the truth, just as I said about the disciples. But there's only one issue here. As I've pointed out last week, the Apostle Paul was not part of the original 11, then 12, with the replacement of the other disciples, but rather in his own time, as he says, as one born out of due time, has an encounter with the risen Christ. And if we want to date his conversion, we date his conversion to approximately not more than 1 to 1.5 years after the resurrection of Christ. And to him, Christ appears on the Damascus Road when he basically does not, he's blinded by a light that comes down from heaven. And artwork through the ages has captured these images for us, and many of those artful images are even wrong in their depictions, but they've been captured before there was a printed machine by Gutenberg. There were images to tell the story. These images have been perpetuated long before we can even wrap our minds around some type of warped thinking to perpetuate and pull a lie over the whole world. I go back to these things, and I'm tossing out a whole bunch of stuff randomly like this. It's almost like a paintball attack. I hope you feel that way. To get you to say, whoa, because that's what I want. I want today not to come to some conclusive point, because you can't do it in an hour, but with all the information that I've been presenting over the many weeks, and specifically over the last few, it begs the question that if this is what Paul says, if it's not true, we should be pitied. We're just pitiful people and still in our sins and not much to do about us. But if it's true, and the reason why he wrote this, if it is true, if Christ is risen, because at Corinth, they had a real issue. They did not believe there was a resurrection of the dead by somebody else's preaching, whether it was by pagans, by the Jews who were the Judaizers, or by anyone else. There was no resurrection for them. So correctively, he says, I'm going to tell you what I received first, and essentially how these other people received it, and now you're all receiving it. Now, we tend to, I say, look at all this information and then conveniently forget about it. I'm asking you to not forget about it. I'm asking you to actually read your Bible throughout this next week with the mind that says, you know what, I'm going to take the posture and the gamble. I want to try and disprove this. I want to find holes in the story. And believe me, you will. If you're looking just like somebody who's trying to convince other people, if you can use any argument, and it could be a straw one, but that'll be your argument. I'm not asking you to use straw or wind, but I am asking you to look. And when you look, you find something pretty radical. I'm going back to what Jesus said about himself, his claims on the resurrection, and the Apostle Paul. These two have no reason to ever connect. If Jesus' resurrection is a lie, these two don't have any reason to meet. Paul is way outside of the pale of the disciples. In fact, as I said last week, and I've said many times, he was an accomplice to the stoning of Stephen, who was a committed disciple and was stoned. We read about this in the book of Acts. He preaches a brilliant sermon, and then they stone him. The religious leaders stone Stephen. Paul stood by and watched as this happened. So he's an accomplice, an accessory to this event. It makes no sense if you're going to whitewash, or you're going to try and tell the story to be more convincing, to include the fact that this man persecuted the church, that he persecuted believers, that he had an encounter with the risen Christ. He's not one of the band that has something to lose to keep convincing people. He is risen. His testimony is so damaging to a man who has high ranking. That's why I use the example of the Pope. If the Pope came out today and said, I'm no longer a Catholic, but I'm a Protestant, I would tell you something. A lot of people would be lost in their tracks. Some people would be in disbelief. Some people would start probably riotous people who love the Catholic Church would say, this is preposterous. There'd be a lot of reactions. There wouldn't be a non-reaction to this. And now, go back and look at Paul, and that's why I said this is an important witness. If we're going to take all the witnesses, he's the star witness, who is then going out and planting churches, and he keeps preaching. Jesus lived, he was crucified, he died, he was raised on the third day, he ascended, he's coming back. Now, I get it. I get all the other guys, close disciples, best friends, quasi-relatives that want to protect this failed Jesus. But what about this Apostle Paul? Furthermore, I mean, there's so many different areas to look at, but why would you ruin your life? See, from the time that Paul began to preach the risen Christ, encounter with the risen Christ, hope in Christ, faith in Christ, it says that the religious leaders sought to kill him. And we even have a record of him being led over a wall in a basket because they were trying to kill him. They imprisoned him, and ultimately he paid with his life. So there are all of these interesting dimensions to this unbelievable drama unfolding, the redemption of humankind that culminates in hundreds, if not thousands of years of people prophesying in diverse places, saying different things, different criteria of prophecy pointing to Christ, and then the fulfillment of these prophecies that happen in the lifetime of Jesus. And ultimately, this one born out of due time, the Apostle Paul, who comes on the scene and has no dog in the fight. There's no reason why he should have left his career, his accomplishments, his prestigious standing to go out and preach the message, Jesus is risen, unless you're a lunatic, a liar, or you actually had an encounter. And his encounter is not just on the Damascus Road, for in the book of Galatians, it talks about how Paul was in the desert of Arabia, and most people do not know. We have the record of Jesus traveling in the lands that he did, but we have good records that tell you Jesus also walked in other places with records, enough that eventually, if you'll tune in again, I'll present them to you. I told you I'm equally going to spend I don't think I can do it on a Sunday service, but I can definitely do it on the Festival of Faith, where I can sit here for as long as I want and describe to you why the New Testament documents are reliable. And there are many great scholars such as F.F. Bruce, Metzger, Mounce, and others who contribute an enormous contribution, a wealth of information, resources, places to look and peel apart. I could name off many other scholars who are probably at the high elitist place in terms of their scholastic achievements, who have definitely helped push an understanding of just how reliable these documents are. But one must be willing to examine the evidence. That does indeed require some time. So, what do I want to wrap this up with? Because I am running out of time here. I'm hoping, you will tune in next week so I can talk subject-specific. I am hoping that those of you who are interested, I'm going to tell you the subjects that may or may not occur within this teaching series, but as I said, they may occur on the Festival of Faith, which is I am putting together, because of my fascination with the development of language and the transmission of the Bible, I'm actually putting together some type of a chart that shows you the progression of these various translations and a lot of what went into the chronicles of just these versions being produced that offer great insight historically with another dimension to look at. I have great questions that I want to present to you and things that I want to consider as thought-provoking, such as secular historians recording, for example, that there wasn't an Arabic Bible in circulation before either the 8th or the 11th century. But we know that's not true. In fact, when people talk about this, they tend to gloss it over, and there's a reason for glossing it over. There's protecting the writings of Muhammad. Because if people knew that there was actually a version in circulation in a Semitic tongue, Arabic is a Semitic tongue, Arabic, Ethiopic, Hebrew, Aramaic, they are all in the Semitic tree. So a version of such had been circulating. We're not talking about simply an Old Testament, but an Old and New Testament. And some form of it was circulating very early on. The cover-up is that if this was made known as a hardcore fact, it could actually turn many people away from believing in the validity of Muhammad's writing. So I'm just telling you, if we're willing to look, you can find lots of things of interest. And again, going back to old documents, things that I have in my resources available to me, which makes me a good candidate to present this information to you for your consideration, as it is evidence that does indeed demand a decision that you have to come to. I'm not going to make it for you. So with that being said, let me say this about Easter and this Easter time. We look at Easter today, this Sunday. Not the same eyes, perhaps, all the same information, but not the same eyes as we did last year and last Easter. This Easter, many people are looking at the resurrection of Jesus Christ and looking to Christ for comfort, for hope, for reassurance. And what I want to tell you, it's the most wonderful thing. Just like this will pass, and the fear and the people being afraid and panicking and being confused. Eventually we'll settle down and eventually we'll go away. Whether it comes back or not is a question mark. But as we turn for comfort, reassurance, and focus our minds on something other than the damn news, which if you're like me, I just don't want to hear it. I'm tired of hearing it. I want to hear about the good news. And the good news today is that Christ gives me hope, not just, by the way, not just of when I die, I will be raised up and I'll live with him, but gives me hope in the now, that whatever I'm going through, and let's talk about what we're going through as a country or what the world is experiencing, even though many people have abandoned the faith, have gone to other faiths, the same God yesterday, today, and for the future, for those who will turn and believe, is still saying the same thing. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. It's through me, Jesus speaking, that people will gain a real assurance that there is something beyond the here and now, but while I'm here, I have comfort in him and his promise to me. You will never leave me nor forsake me. And on this resurrection day, I want all of my listeners, regardless of your background, regardless of your education on this subject, regardless of your understanding, to know one thing. He came to die for all humankind. There are still many people, and throughout history, who have refused, rejected, and denied. I can't speak for them. I can't speak for people who don't want to spend the time. But I can speak for the people like you who are tuned in. For some reason, you're still listening to me after well over an hour of just talking, to say there's something more I need to understand or know before I come to a conclusion other than what most of us have come to in examining the evidence. He is risen. Not, I think he's risen. He is risen indeed. Happy Easter, folks. And for those of you kind of just barely making it through, we're all going to come through this a little bit tried, a little bit refined, maybe a little bit more focused on what's really important, not all these other things that distract us. Hopefully that will be the outcome, and hopefully people will at least take a new approach to a very old and true message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.